Welcome to Wild Cowboy Tales. Before we walk into the smoldering ruins of a life and follow a trail of vengeance paved with blood and ash, do us a favor. Stamp that subscribe button like a brand on a prize steer and ring that notification bell so you never miss a single story from the unforgiving heart of the American West. Now, settle in and listen to the legend of the rancher's daughter, a girl who lost everything to the flames and swore to turn an entire county into a graveyard. The sky over the Sweetwater Valley was the only cathedral Abigail Thorne had ever known. It was a vast, boundless canvas of impossible blues in the daytime and a spill of diamond dust at night. Underneath it, the Thorne Ranch was a world unto itself, a kingdom of rolling green pastures, fat cattle, and the quiet, sturdy love between a father and his daughter. Her father, Jedediah Thorne, was a man carved from the land itself. His hands were calloused, his face was a roadmap of sun and wind, but his eyes held a gentle kindness, and his laughter was a low, rumbling thing that could soothe a spooked horse or a troubled heart. Abigail, at 17, was a child of this land. Her hair was the color of sun-cured hay, and her spirit was as free and untamed as the wild mustangs that sometimes crested the distant mesas. Her mother had been taken by a fever years ago, leaving a void that she and her father had filled with a deep and spoken bond of mutual reliance and affection. Her world was one of hard work and simple joys, the smell of rain on the dry earth, the satisfaction of a newborn calf finding its feet, the sound of her father's old guitar in the evenings as he played the simple, sad songs of the trail. It was a good life, a peaceful life, a life she believed would stretch on forever under that big, benevolent sky. The shadow that fell upon their world was cast by a man named Silas Corbin. Corbin was a new kind of power in the county, a man who dealt not in cattle, but in contracts, lawyers, and the quiet, corrosive influence of money. He was buying up the land, piece by piece, for the railroad that was rumored to be coming through. He saw the Sweetwater Valley not as a collection of homes, but as a line on a map, and the Thorne Ranch, with its critical water rights, sat squarely in his path. Jedediah Thorne was not a man to be bought or intimidated. He was the last major holdout in the valley. He had politely, then firmly, refused every one of Corbin's increasingly generous, then threatening offers. "This land holds more than just water, Mr. Corbin," Jedediah had told him on their last, tense meeting. "It holds my wife's bones and my daughter's future. It is not for sale." Corbin had smiled, a cold, thin expression that held no warmth. "Everything has a price, Mr. Thorne," he had said. Everything. The price was paid on a moonless, starless night. Abigail was awakened not by a sound, but by a smell sharp, acrid stench of kerosene, followed by the hungry crackle of fire. She threw open the door of her small bedroom and was met by a wall of heat and a terrifying, orange glow. The main room of the ranch house was an inferno. Through the smoke and the roaring flames, she saw a scene from the deepest pits of hell. Shapes of men, dark silhouettes against the fire, were moving through the room. She saw her father, his nightshirt torn, fighting with the desperate fury of a cornered grizzly. He was not armed with his familiar Colt, but with a heavy iron poker from the fireplace. He swung it with a mighty roar, and one of the dark shapes went down. But he was one man against a half-dozen. She saw the leader, a man whose face was briefly illuminated by a collapsing beam. He had the cold, dead eyes of a vulture, and he was laughing. He raised a pistol, and a shot rang out, impossibly loud even over the roar of the fire. Abigail saw her father stagger. She saw him look toward her bedroom door, his face a mask of love and agony. He tried to speak her name, but only a choked, bloody sound came out. He collapsed into the flames, and the last of Abigail's world turned to ash. A wave of heat and smoke threw her back into her room. The fire was everywhere, eating the drywood of the house with a terrifying speed. Her mind, shattered by grief and terror, was working on pure instinct. Her window, the only way out. She wrapped a blanket around herself, smashed the glass with a small wooden chair, and scrambled out, cutting her hands and arms on the jagged shards. She fell to the soft earth of her mother's rose garden and crawled, scrambling away from the inferno, her lungs burning, her sobs choked and silent. She took refuge in the darkness of the creek bed at the edge of the property and watched, helpless, as the fire consumed everything she had ever known or loved. The ranch house, the barn, the stable, all of it was being devoured. The screams of the horses, trapped in the burning stable, were a sound that would be seared into her memory forever. She watched as the dark shapes of the men, their work done, rode away, their whoops and hollers a profane celebration of their destruction. The last thing she saw was the vulture-eyed man, the leader, pausing on a nearby ridge. He looked back at the fire, a silhouette against his own handiwork, and she saw him light a cigar, its tip glowing like a single, malevolent red star. Then he, too, was gone. Abigail lay in the cold water of the creek all night, her body shaking with a grief so profound it was a physical illness. The fire burned for hours, a massive, roaring pyre that lit up the night sky, a funeral for her life. When the dawn finally came, it was to a world of gray ash and black, skeletal timbers. The sky, once her cathedral, was now a dirty, smoke-choked shroud. Her home was gone. Her father was gone. Her entire world was a smoldering, silent ruin. The girl who had lived for the sunrise now prayed she would never have to see another one. The sunrise, when it came, was a cruel mockery. Its gentle, rosy light did not bring warmth or hope, only a clearer, more brutal illumination of the devastation. Abigail Thorne walked through the ruins of her life like a ghost in her own graveyard. The air was thick with the smell of wet ash and finality. The great barn was a collapsed skeleton of charred timbers. The ranch house, the home her father had built with his own two hands, was a blackened, smoking foundation, a gaping wound in the earth. Nothing was left. She found what remained of her father near what had been the hearth, the one place he had always said was the heart of the home. There was not much left to bury. The fire had taken him, just as it had taken everything else. She sank to her knees in the ash, a single, dry, guttural sob escaping her throat. The tears would not come. Her grief was a thing too vast, too hot for tears. It was a white-hot furnace in her soul, burning away the soft, gentle girl she had been, leaving only a core of rage as hard and as sharp as obsidian. She spent the day in a daze of grim, methodical work. She fashioned a crude shovel from a piece of scorched planking and dug a grave for her father on the small hill overlooking the valley, next to the simple stone that marked her mother's resting place. She gathered what she could of him and laid him to rest. There were no prayers, no eulogies, only a silence that was louder and more profound than any scream. As she stood over the fresh-turned earth, the full, crushing weight of her solitude settled upon her. She was utterly and completely alone. She had no family, no home, no future. They had not just killed her father, they had erased her world. They had intended to erase her. And in that moment, standing on the ashes of her past, she made a decision. They had failed. She was still here, and she would become their living, breathing, and final regret. She turned her back on the graves and walked back to the ruins of the house. She began to sift through the debris, not looking for keepsakes or mementos, but for weapons. She found what she was looking for in the place where her father's bedroom had been. The fire had been so hot it had warped the metal, but they were still there, buried in the ash, his old cold peacemaker. Its wooden grips burned away, leaving only the scorched metal frame. And the hickory handle of his favorite hatchet, the steel head still intact, if blackened by the soot. She picked them up. The revolver was hot to the touch, as if it still held the heat of the fire that had taken her world. The hatchet felt heavy, a brutal, practical tool. These were the instruments of her father's life. He had used the gun to protect his land, the hatchet to build his home. In her hands, they would become something else entirely. They would become the instruments of her vengeance. She took the scorched, skeletal gun and the blackened hatchet to the creek. She sat for hours, cleaning them, scraping away the soot, polishing the metal with sand until it gleamed with a dull, menacing light. As she worked, a cold, meticulous plan began to form in her mind. She would not go to the law. The law in this county was a man named Silas Corbin. She would not run. There was nowhere to run to. She would hunt. She knew the name of the man who had ordered this Corbin. But she had also seen the faces of the men who had carried it out, particularly the vulture-eyed man who had led them, the one who had smoked a cigar as her world burned. She would find them all. The men who held the torches, the men who gave the orders, the man at the very top who believed his money made him a god. She would dismantle his world just as he had dismantled hers. She would take everything from him, piece by bloody piece, until he was left with nothing but the same ash and ruin he had left for her. "I will not forget," she whispered to the empty, smoke-stained sky, her voice a low, chilling rasp. "I will not forgive. I will not rest. I will be the fire that cleanses this land. I will be the grave that waits for you all. I swear this on the ashes of my father." She was no longer Abigail Thorne, the rancher's daughter. That girl was dead, buried on the hill with her parents. What rose from the embers of the Thorne Ranch was a new creation, a creature of fire and blood, of ash and iron. She took her father's scorched gun and his blackened hatchet, and she walked away from the ruins of her life, not looking back. She was heading for the nearest town, not to find shelter, but to find a gunsmith who could give her father's gun a new set of grips, and to begin the long, bloody process of turning an entire county into a graveyard. The first town Abigail rode into was a place called Dust Devil Creek, a settlement that was little more than a single, dusty street gasping for life under the relentless sun. She had traded her last good horse, a creature she had raised from a foal, for a tough, anonymous Mustang, a bag of supplies, and a new name. She was no longer Abigail. She was now Ash, a name born of the ruin of her home, a name that was a constant, burning reminder of her purpose. Her first stop was the gunsmith. He was an old, grizzled man with eyes that had seen too much, and he looked at the scorched, skeletal frame of the Colt she placed on his counter. "Been through a fire," he grunted, picking it up with a practiced hand. "So have I," Ash replied, her voice flat and devoid of emotion. She didn't ask for fancy ivory or pearl. She had him fit the gun with simple, dark, and adorned walnut grips. When he was done, the gun was whole again, but it was a changed thing. The new, dark wood against the fire-scorched, heat-blued metal gave it a unique, menacing look. It was a gun that had been to hell and back. It was her gun now. She spent the next 3 months in the wilderness surrounding the town, her only companions the gun, the hatchet, and the ghosts of her family. The gentle, laughing girl was buried under a mountain of relentless, self-inflicted hardship. She taught herself to shoot, her father's old lessons a faint echo in her mind. She started with tin cans, then moved to moving targets, then to the brutal, snap shooting required for a real gunfight. The crack of her pistol was a constant, lonely sound in the empty canyons. She practiced with the hatchet until her arm was a corded knot of muscle. She learned to throw it with a deadly, spinning accuracy. She learned to fight with it, her movements a blur of controlled, savage violence. She hardened her body, running for miles under the hot sun, her lungs burning. She hardened her soul, sleeping on the cold ground, her dreams filled with the faces of the men she would one day kill. She was baptizing herself in the fire of her own will. Her hunt began with a whisper. She knew she couldn't go after the vulture-eyed leader first. She had to start at the bottom, with the hired thugs who had held the torches. Men like that are careless. They talk, they drink, they brag. She drifted from one dusty, forgotten town to another, a quiet, watchful presence in the corners of saloons, her ears open. She found her first target in a town called Perdition. His name was Billy the Torch Hanks, a low-level arsonist and bully who was known to work for Corbin's land acquisition company. Ash watched him for a week. She saw a man whose only pleasure was in cruelty, a man who liked to hurt those weaker than himself. She did not challenge him to a duel. She did not give him a chance. She followed him one night as he stumbled, drunk, out of a cantina. In a dark, narrow alleyway, she confronted him. He barely had time to register her presence before the hatchet was in her hand. He saw a flash of steel, and then a searing, blinding pain as the blade buried itself in his shoulder, pinning him to the wooden wall of the building. He screamed, a high, thin sound of agony and terror. She stepped out of the shadows, and he saw her face, her eyes burning with a cold, righteous fire. "Do you remember the Thorne Ranch?" she asked, her voice a low, chilling whisper. "Do you remember the fire?" He babbled, he pleaded, he swore he was just following orders. She felt nothing. No pity, no satisfaction, just a cold, empty finality. She pulled her hatchet free. He crumpled to the ground, a whimpering, broken thing. She did not kill him. Not yet. She pressed the hot barrel of her father's Colt against his forehead. The one with the eyes of a vulture. "Blackwood," he sobbed. "Jed Blackwood." Corbin's foreman. Please. She had a name. It was the first piece of the puzzle. She looked down at the pathetic man, and for a moment, a flicker of her old self, the girl who had cried over a bird with a broken wing, felt a pang of something like pity. She stamped it out. Pity was a luxury she could no longer afford. Her shot was a single, flat, definitive crack. She left him in the alley and walked away, not looking back. The first man on her list was dead, and the legend had begun. The story of the killing and perdition spread. They spoke of the strange, almost ritualistic nature of the attack, of the woman who had asked about a fire before she delivered her judgment. 2 months later, another of Corbin's known enforcers was found dead, this time with a hatchet in his chest. Then a third, shot dead in a fair fight he had been goaded into by a quiet, determined woman with fire in her eyes. The county began to whisper. They spoke of a new, terrifying force of retribution. They didn't know her name, so they gave her one born of their fear. They called her the Ashen Daughter, the girl who had risen from the ashes of her father's ranch to turn the whole damn county into a graveyard. And with each man she killed, the name grew louder, the legend more terrifying, and the path to Jed Blackwood, and ultimately to Silas Corbin, grew shorter and bloodier. The trail of blood and ash left by the Ashen Daughter cut a swath of fear across the county. With each man she put in the ground, her skills became sharper, her movements more certain, her heart a little colder. The soft, laughing girl who had loved the feel of sunshine on her face was a distant memory, a ghost from another life. The woman she was now lived for the cold satisfaction of a crossed-off name, the grim purpose of the hunt. She had become the thing she had set out to be, a living, breathing instrument of vengeance. But the ghost of Abigail Thorne was not entirely gone. It would surface at the most unexpected moments, a painful, disorienting echo of a life she had lost. It would happen when she saw a field of wildflowers that reminded her of her mother's garden, or when she heard the distant, lonely sound of a guitar that sounded like her father's. In these moments, the weight of what she was doing, of what she had become, would press down on her with a suffocating force. She was riding through the High Chaparral, tracking another of Corbin's men, a man named Peters, when she came across a small, struggling mission run by an old priest, Father Michael. A fever had swept through the small community of settlers and natives who lived there, and the old priest was overwhelmed. Ash, intending only to ask for water and directions, found herself stopping. She saw the sick and the dying, the fear and the exhaustion in the old priest's eyes. The hunter in her, the part that was now her dominant self, told her to ride on. This was not her concern. Her concern was with Peters, who was getting further away with every passing hour. But the part of her that was still Abigail, the daughter of the kind and decent Jedediah Thorne, could not turn away. She saw her own past in their suffering. She saw the fragility of the lives they were trying to build, lives that could be snuffed out by a fever, or by the greed of men like Corbin. She stayed. For a week, she put down her gun and her hatchet, and she took up a water bucket and a cool cloth. She nursed the sick, her hands, which had become so adept at taking life, now working to preserve it. She did not speak of who she was. To the grateful people of the mission, she was just a quiet, stern, but surprisingly gentle stranger who had appeared when they needed her most. One evening, as she sat with Father Michael, watching over a sleeping child whose fever had just broken, the old priest looked at her, his eyes full of a sad wisdom. "There is a great war inside you, my child," he said softly. "I see it in your eyes. They are the eyes of a soldier who has seen too much." "I am not a soldier, Father," Ash replied, her voice low. "I am a debt collector." "Vengeance is a heavy debt to carry," he said. "It is a fire that provides a brilliant light, but in the end, it consumes the one who holds the torch. Is there no room in your heart for forgiveness?" "The men I am hunting burned forgiveness to the ground along with my home," she said, her voice turning to ice. "The only thing I have left for them is a final reckoning." "And what of yourself?" the priest asked gently. "Will you be able to forgive yourself when it is all over?" His question struck her with the force of a physical blow. It was a question she had never dared to ask herself. She was so focused on the sins of her enemies that she had never stopped to tally the cost to her own soul. Every man she killed, no matter how evil, was a step further away from the woman her father had raised her to be. She was destroying them, but was she also destroying herself? She left the mission the next day, her target, Peters, now long gone. But her brief time there had changed her. The cold, clear certainty of her path was now muddied with a painful, confusing doubt. She was a killer, yes, but she was also a healer. She was a monster born of hate, but she was also a woman capable of compassion. She looked in the mirror of a still watering trough and saw two faces staring back at her, the cold, hard face of the Ashen daughter, and the sad, lost eyes of Abigail Thorne. And for the first time, she was terrified that the longer she walked this path, the more the second face would fade, until nothing was left but the ghost. The internal war the priest had spoken of had found its battlefield, and it was raging in the desolate landscape of her own heart. The name Jed Blackwood had become a focal point for Abigail's rage. He was not the ultimate source of her pain that was Silas Corbin, but he was its face. It was Blackwood's vulture-eyed visage she saw in her nightmares, his mocking laughter she heard in the wind. He was Corbin's foreman, his chief enforcer, the man who translated his boss's cold, calculated greed into the hot, brutal reality of fire and blood. To get to Corbin, she had to go through Blackwood. After her time at the mission, Abigail's hunt took on a new, colder precision. The internal conflict still raged, but she compartmentalized it, pushing the ghost of Abigail down into a deep, quiet place in her soul. On the surface, she was Ash, the hunter, and her focus was absolute. She learned that Blackwood and his core group of enforcers had made the town of Brimstone their base of operations. Brimstone was Corbin's town, bought and paid for. The sheriff was on his payroll. The judge was in his pocket. It was a snake pit, and Blackwood was the biggest snake. Abigail knew she could not ride into Brimstone directly. She was a known entity now, her legend a double-edged sword. She was feared, but she was also hunted. So she decided to draw Blackwood out. She began a campaign of strategic harassment against Corbin's operations in the surrounding county. She wasn't just killing his men, she was bleeding his profits, attacking the very source of his power. She would strike at his supply lines, causing a wagon full of expensive mining equipment to be found with its axles mysteriously broken at the bottom of a ravine. She would start a stampede, scattering a herd of his prize cattle to the four winds. These were acts of a ghost. There were no witnesses, no gunfights, just the costly, unnerving results. And at the sight of each act of sabotage, she left her calling card, a small, hand-carved feather made of scorched pine, a symbol of the Ashen daughter. The pressure mounted on Blackwood. Corbin, a man who measured the world in profit and loss, was furious. He saw his empire being dismantled by a single, phantom woman, and he held his foreman responsible. He gave Blackwood an ultimatum: find this ghost and kill her, or find a new line of work. Blackwood, his pride and his position on the line, was forced to act. He gathered his 10 best men, a posse of ruthless killers, and rode out from Brimstone, determined to hunt down the Ashen daughter and bring back her head. He was a skilled tracker and a cunning tactician. He was confident he could trap and kill one woman. He was riding into her territory, onto her chosen battlefield, and that was exactly what Abigail had been counting on. She led them on a chase for 3 days, through the rugged, labyrinthine canyons of the Badlands. She let them see her, a fleeting glimpse of a lone rider on a distant ridge, always just out of reach, drawing them deeper and deeper into the wilderness, further from their town, their power base, their reinforcements. She chose her ground for the final confrontation, a place the old prospectors called the Devil's Amphitheater, a massive, bowl-shaped canyon with steep, unclimbable walls and only one narrow entrance. It was a natural trap. She prepared her battlefield. She spent a day and a night rigging the canyon. She created rock slides, set snares, and positioned herself in a high, hidden crevice that gave her a commanding view of the canyon floor. When Blackwood and his posse rode into the canyon, following her fresh tracks, they felt a sense of triumph. They had her. She was trapped. The tracks led to the back of the canyon and disappeared. "She's in here somewhere," Blackwood snarled to his men, his eyes scanning the rocks. "Spread out. Find her. I want her alive, if possible. The boss wants to have a word with her before she hangs." As his men dismounted and began to spread out, Abigail acted. From her high perch, she used her rifle to sever a single, taut rope. It was the trigger for her main trap. A massive rock slide she had prepared at the canyon's entrance gave way, and tons of rock and earth cascaded down, sealing the entrance completely. They were locked in. Panic and confusion erupted below. Before they could recover, Abigail began her deadly work. It was not a chaotic firefight. It was a methodical, one-sided execution. She was a sniper, a ghost in the rocks. She did not miss. One by one, Blackwood's men fell, picked off with a chilling precision. They fired wildly at the cliffs, their bullets ricocheting harmlessly, their shouts of anger turning to screams of terror. In less than 5 minutes, all of Blackwood's men were dead or dying. Only the foreman himself remained, huddled behind a large boulder, his face a mask of disbelief and stark terror. The hunter had become the hunted. Abigail did not shoot him. She wanted him to see her. She made her way down the treacherous cliff face, appearing before him like an avenging angel, her father's Colt in one hand, the hatchet in the other. "Blackwood," she said, her voice echoing in the sudden, terrible silence of the canyon. He stared at her, his vulture's eyes now wide with the fear of a cornered prey. He finally saw her, truly saw her, not as a legend, not as a ghost, but as the girl from the ranch, the girl whose world he had burned. "The rancher's daughter," he breathed. "You remembered," she said, her voice as cold as a grave. "I was hoping you would." He made a last, desperate lunge, his pistol clearing its holster. But he was a broken, terrified man, his movements clumsy. She was calm, focused, inevitable. Her Colt roared. Her hatchet flew. The bullet took him in the shoulder, spinning him round. The hatchet buried itself in his chest. He collapsed to the dusty floor of the canyon, a final, guttural cry escaping his lips. Abigail walked over to him. He was still alive, barely, his eyes pleading. She looked down at the face that had haunted her dreams, and she felt nothing. Just a vast, cold emptiness. The fire of her hatred for him had been so all-consuming that his death felt like an anticlimax. She knelt and retrieved her hatchet. He rasped her name, or a curse, she wasn't sure. She stood, turned her back on him, and began the long walk out of the canyon, leaving him to die alone with his dead men, a king in a kingdom of corpses. The foreman's debt was paid. Only the architect of it all, Silas Corbin, remained. The news of the massacre at the Devil's Amphitheater struck the county like a lightning bolt. A dozen of Silas Corbin's best men, including his notorious foreman Jed Blackwood, had been wiped out. The story, told by a terrified prospector who had stumbled upon the canyon of corpses, was a wild, unbelievable tale of a single woman, an army of ghosts, and a rockslide that had sealed a tomb. The legend of the Ashen Daughter was now cemented in the territory's folklore. She was no longer just a killer, she was an inescapable force of nature, a divine or demonic instrument of retribution, depending on who was telling the story. For Silas Corbin, sitting in his opulent office in the town of Brimstone, the story was a death knell. He was a man of logic and control, but the world he had so carefully constructed was being dismantled by something that defied logic. He was the most powerful man in the county, with the law in his pocket and a fortune in his bank, yet he was being systematically destroyed by a teenage girl he had dismissed as collateral damage. The irony was a bitter, corrosive acid in his soul. Fear, an emotion he had long considered beneath him, was now his constant companion. He became a prisoner in his own town. He never left his heavily guarded mansion, a 2-story brick monstrosity that was both his fortress and his cage. He hired a new army of gunslingers, paying them exorbitant sums, but he saw the fear in their eyes. They were not loyal soldiers, they were mercenaries who had heard the stories, and their loyalty would last only as long as they believed his walls could protect them. He drank heavily, his nights filled with nightmares of fire and a girl's accusing eyes. He saw her everywhere in the flicker of a candle's flame, in the face of a serving girl, in the shadows that seemed to lengthen and deepen in his own home. He was a man being haunted to death. Abigail, after the battle in the canyon, did not press her advantage. She did not ride directly for Brimstone. She knew that Corbin's fear was now her most powerful weapon. She decided to let him simmer in it, to let his own mind become her accomplice. She retreated into the wilderness, to the quiet solitude that was now her only home. She was wrestling with her own ghosts. The emptiness that had followed Blackwood's death had not faded. It had grown, a cold, hollow space in her chest where her heart used to be. The memories of her peaceful life, the flashbacks that had once been a torment, were now a refuge she actively sought. She would sit for hours, staring into a campfire, remembering the sound of her father's guitar, the warmth of his hand on her shoulder. These memories were a painful reminder of the person she had been, of the humanity she felt slipping away with every act of violence. The priest's question echoed in her mind, "Will you be able to forgive yourself?" She knew, with a chilling certainty, that the answer was no. She had waded too deep into a river of blood to ever be clean again. But she could not stop. To stop now, with Corbin still alive, still powerful, would be to render all of her sacrifices, all of the pieces of her soul she had lost, meaningless. She was trapped on a path of her own making, a path that could only end with one final death. After a month of letting the fear and brimstone fester, she began the final stage of her campaign. She would not attack Corbin's fortress. She would dismantle his kingdom from the outside in, leaving him an isolated king with no subjects and no power. She started by becoming a voice for the voiceless. She sent anonymous letters, carried by sympathetic travelers, to the territorial newspaper in the capital. The letters, written in a clear, educated hand, detailed the crimes of Silas Corbin's land grabs, the intimidation, the murder of Jedediah Thorne. She signed them simply, "A Witness." The stories, at first dismissed, began to gain traction, corroborated by the whispers of the ranchers and homesteaders Corbin had displaced. An official inquiry was launched, and the foundations of Corbin's legal and political power began to crack. Next, she attacked his wealth. She became a phantom saboteur. The main bridge that connected his logging operations to the railroad was mysteriously burned in the middle of the night. A cattle drive, carrying 1,000 head of his beef to market, was stampeded by a series of small, strategic fires, the herd scattered across 100 miles of open range. She never showed herself. She never fired a shot. She just left her signature, the small, scorched feather. His empire was bleeding money, and his powerful business partners in the East began to grow nervous. The town of Brimstone itself became her final target. It was a town that had sold its soul to Corbin for the promise of prosperity. Now, she would show them the price of that bargain. She began a campaign of quiet, psychological terror aimed not at the common folk, but at the pillars of Corbin's power: sheriff, the judge, the mayor, all men on his payroll. The sheriff would find a hangman's noose, woven from scorched rope, hanging on his office door. The judge would find a page torn from a Bible, the passage about false witness, pinned to his gavel with a knife. The mayor, a man with a secret gambling addiction, would receive a package containing a single bullet and a deck of cards with all the aces missing. These were not threats of immediate violence. They were intimate, terrifying messages that said, "I know who you are. I know your sins. And I am coming." One by one, Corbin's pillars of support crumbled. The mayor fled town in the middle of the night. The judge resigned, citing ill health. The sheriff turned in his badge and was not seen again. The town's corrupt infrastructure, which had seemed so solid, dissolved into a puddle of fear. Silas Corbin was now truly alone. His political allies were distancing themselves. His wealth was draining away. His town had abandoned him. He was a king with no kingdom, a general with no army, a man sitting in a brick mansion, surrounded by a handful of terrified, highly paid gunslingers, waiting for a ghost to come and claim his soul. The Ashen daughter had not just turned the county into a graveyard for his men, she had turned his entire life into a kingdom of ash. The town of Brimstone was a hollowed-out shell, a corpse of a community waiting for its final burial. The businesses were shuttered, the streets were empty, the silence broken only by the mournful whistle of the wind and the nervous, boot-shuffling patrols of Silas Corbin's last dozen hired guns. They were the only things standing between him and the ghost who had systematically destroyed his world. Abigail watched from a high butte overlooking the town. She had done it. She had stripped him of his power, his wealth, his allies. He was isolated, a wounded beast in his lair. Now, only the final, physical act of retribution remained. And she knew, with a cold certainty, that it had to happen here, in the heart of the kingdom he had built, in front of the silent, watching eyes of the town he had corrupted. The internal war that had raged within her had reached a quiet, somber truce. The ghost of Abigail Thorne and the specter of the Ashen daughter had merged. She was no longer fighting her own humanity, she was using it. Her fight was not just for the dead anymore, it was for the living, for the possibility of a world where men like Corbin could not act with impunity. This was not just an ending, it was a cleansing. She sent her final message. It was delivered not by a letter, but by an action. In the dead of night, she slipped into the town. She did not go near Corbin's mansion. She went to the town's small, neglected cemetery. There, she dug a single, fresh, empty grave. At its head, she placed a crude wooden cross. And on the cross, she burned a single name with a branding iron: Corbin. The discovery of the open grave at dawn sent the final, definitive shockwave of terror through the town and through Corbin's mansion. It was not a threat. It was an appointment. Corbin, a man now teetering on the edge of a whiskey-soaked madness, finally broke. He would not wait in his house to be picked off. He would meet this challenge head-on. He would force a final, bloody confrontation on his own terms. She wants a fight. We'll give her one, he roared to his terrified men. We're going to turn this whole damn street into a shooting gallery. I want every man on a rooftop and a window. When she comes, I want her turned into dog meat before she takes 10 steps. He was making a classic tactical mistake, spreading his men thin, creating a dozen isolated positions, and in doing so, he was playing directly into her hands. At high noon, under a blazing, indifferent sun, she appeared. A lone, dark figure at the end of the long, empty main street. She was not a whirlwind of rage. She was a picture of calm, deadly resolve. Her father's Colt was on her hip, the hatchet at her side. She began her slow, deliberate walk. The first shot came from a sniper on the hotel roof. The bullet kicked up dust a yard in front of her. She did not stop. She did not even flinch. She kept walking. This unnerving calm was a weapon in itself. The gunmen, expecting a frantic, running target, were unnerved by her steady, remorseless advance. Their shots were hurried, inaccurate. Bullets whined past her, chewing up the wooden storefronts on either side. She was walking through a storm of lead, yet she seemed untouched, a figure from a nightmare. But she was not just walking. She was observing. She was marking their positions. The flash of a rifle from a second-story window. A puff of smoke from an alleyway. She was mapping her battlefield. Halfway down the street, she made her move. She dove, not for cover, but through the swinging doors of the abandoned Grand Saloon. The gunmen, assuming she was trapped, concentrated their fire on the saloon, riddling its false front with 1,000 splinters. But she was already gone. She had gone straight through the saloon and out the back door, into the warren of alleys and backlots that ran behind the main street. She was now in their blind spot. She was in her element. What followed was a masterclass in urban guerrilla warfare. She moved through the alleys like a phantom, using the shadows, the stacks of crates, the forgotten detritus of the town as her cover. She began to hunt them, one by one, from behind. A gunman, peering out of a back window, would feel a sudden, cold touch on his shoulder, and then the final, brutal bite of a hatchet. Two more, guarding an alley, would be cut down by a volley of shots from a rooftop they had thought was empty. She was a whisper, a shadow, a blur of motion. She was everywhere at once. The disciplined firing from the front of the street devolved into sporadic, panicked shots. The gunmen, realizing they were being hunted from behind, abandoned their posts, their carefully laid trap now a chaotic, every man for himself scramble for survival. In less than 10 minutes, the battle was over. The silence that descended was broken only by the groaning of a wounded man. Abigail had not killed all of them. She had been brutally, lethally efficient, but she had only killed the ones who had stood their ground. The others had fled, their nerve broken. She emerged from an alleyway back onto the main street. It was littered with the bodies of Corbin's army. At the far end of the street, in front of his mansion, stood one last man. Silas Corbin himself. He held a rifle in his hands, his face a mask of disbelief, rage, and a final, dawning terror. His army was gone. His fortress was breached. It was just him and the ghost of the girl whose life he had destroyed. The final battle was about to be joined. The main street of Brimstone was a stage set for a tragedy. The dust, stirred by the brief, violent gunfight, hung in the air, catching the high noon sun in hazy, golden shafts. The bodies of Corbin's men lay where they had fallen, silent testament to a battle that had been lost before the first shot was fired. At one end of the street stood Silas Corbin, a king whose kingdom had just been reduced to the few feet of dusty ground on which he stood. At the other end stood Abigail, the etched daughter, her father's Colt now in her hand, the hatchet at her hip, a silent, brutal promise. For a long moment, they just stared at each other, the 100 yards of empty street a chasm between them. The silence was absolute. "You," Corbin finally said, his voice a raw, incredulous rasp. "After all this, a girl. A goddamn rancher's girl." "I am the last ember of a fire you started, Corbin," Abigail replied, her voice clear and steady, carrying within a natural clarity in the still air. "And I've come to burn the rest of your world to the ground." "I gave you a chance," he roared, his voice cracking with a mixture of rage and a fear he could no longer conceal. "I offered your father a fortune for that worthless piece of dirt." "You offered him money for his wife's grave," she retorted, her voice dropping, becoming as cold and as hard as iron. "You offered him coins for his daughter's future. He had a price you could never understand, because it wasn't for sale. So you decided to take it anyway. You and your man Blackwood." "Blackwood was a fool," Corbin spat. "They were all fools. Weak. But I am not. I built this county. I am this county." "You are a plague," she said, and she began to walk, her steps slow, measured, each one a drumbeat of a final, inevitable sentence. "And I am the cure." He raised his rifle, his movements jerky, his bravado a thin, cracking shell over a core of pure terror. He fired. The shot was wild, born of panic. It whined past her head and shattered the window of the general store behind her. She kept walking, her pace unchanged. Ben's Colt was still held loosely at her side. This was not a long-range duel. This was personal. This had to be done up close. He fired again, and again, emptying the rifle in a frantic, useless volley. Her calm, remorseless advance had shattered his nerve. She was not a human being to him anymore. She was a walking embodiment of his own damnation, and she would not be stopped. She was 50 yards away. 30. 20. He threw the empty rifle down and fumbled for the ornate, silver-plated revolver at his hip, the symbol of his wealth and power. She stopped, 10 yards from him. She slowly raised her father's Colt, its scorched, heat-blued barrel a stark, ugly contrast to his polished silver. "This was my father's gun," she said, her voice quiet, almost conversational. "He was a good man. He believed in building things. All you've ever known is how to burn them." His gun was finally out, the barrel shaking in his hand. He tried to aim, but his terror was a palsying disease. Her shot was not a reaction. It was a conclusion. It was the final, definitive word in a long and bloody conversation. The Colt roared, a single, flat, declarative sound that echoed through the empty town. The bullet struck Corbin in the chest. It did not throw him back. It simply punched a neat, dark hole in his expensive linen shirt. A look of profound, almost comical, surprise crossed his face. He looked down at the blossoming stain, then back up at her. He opened his mouth, as if to make one last threat, one last bargain. But no sound came out. The power, the ambition, the greed, it all just drained out of him, leaving an empty, collapsing vessel. He crumpled to the dust, his fine silver revolver falling from his lifeless hand. Abigail stood over him, the smoking Colt at her side. She looked down at the body of the man who had been the architect of her entire life's tragedy. She felt nothing. The great, roaring fire was gone. The cold purpose was gone. There was only a vast, silent, and aching void. She had done it. She had fulfilled her vow. She had turned his county into a graveyard. And now, she was alone in it. She walked past his body, not even giving it a second glance. She walked to the cemetery, to the fresh, empty grave she had dug. She stood before it for a long time. This was supposed to be his grave, but in a way, it felt like hers. The etched daughter had died with Silas Corbin. She looked at her father's gun in her hand, then at the hatchet at her hip. They were heavy, so incredibly heavy. They were the weight of a dozen lives, the weight of her own lost soul. With a final, weary sigh, she turned and walked away from the grave, away from the town, away from the dead. She walked out into the vast, open country, a solitary figure in a world she had just scoured clean. She had won, but she had no kingdom, no home, and no name. The aftermath of the Battle of Brimstone was a quiet, bewildered affair. The townsfolk, who had huddled in their homes listening to the symphony of gunfire, slowly began to emerge. They saw the bodies of the gunmen, the corpse of their tyrant king lying in the dust, and the open, empty grave that had been his final invitation. Of the ashen daughter, there was no sign. She had vanished as completely and as silently as she had appeared. The county, free from the iron fist of Silas Corbin, began the slow, painful process of healing. The law, real law, trickled back in. The homesteaders Corbin had displaced began to return to their lands. The story of what had happened became the region's founding myth, a grim, bloody fairy tale told to new generations. The ashen daughter became a figure of legend, a specter of righteous wrath. They said she had been an angel of vengeance, sent by God to cleanse the land. They said she was a demon, born of a rancher's fire, who had dragged a dozen souls to hell before disappearing back into the smoke. Abigail, the woman who had been at the center of the storm, wanted no part of the legend. She had walked away from brimstone and had kept on walking. She rode south, into the harsh, anonymous expanse of the desert territories, seeking not a new life, but an absence of one. She was trying to outrun the ghosts, and most of all, the ghost of the woman she had become. She was a creature of the wilderness now, more at home in the silence of the canyons than in the noise of a town. She lived off the land, her skills as a survivor now used for the simple, daily act of existence. The fire that had driven her was gone, leaving a cold, hollow ache that was a constant companion. She was no longer a hunter. She was a pilgrim, wandering through the purgatory of her own making. One evening, months into her journey, she was making a cold camp in a rocky arroyo when she heard a sound. It was the whimper of a child. Cautious, her hand instinctively going to the colt that was still her only companion, she investigated. She found a small, overturned wagon, one wheel splintered. A man, the father, lay nearby, his leg broken, his face pale with pain. A woman, the mother, was trying to comfort a little girl of about 6, who was crying from fear and hunger. They were settlers, their wagon had broken on the harsh trail, and they were stranded. The old Abigail, the girl from the ranch, would have rushed to help without a second thought. The ashen daughter, the cold avenger, would have ridden on, their plight not her concern. The woman she was now, a confused and aching soul trapped between those two poles, simply stood and watched them for a long moment. She saw their fear. She saw their desperation. And in the little girl's eyes, she saw a reflection of the innocence that had been so brutally stolen from her. She made a choice. She spent the next 3 days with them. She used her knowledge of the land to hunt for food. She used the simple medicines she had learned from her father to set the man's leg and tend to their needs. She used her hatchet not as a weapon, but to chop firewood and to help repair the broken wheel. She spoke little, but her presence was a calm, reassuring one. On the third night, as they sat around a small, warm fire, the little girl, whose name was Sarah, crept over and shyly offered her a piece of cornbread. Abigail took it, and their hands touched. The simple, innocent human contact was a jolt, a feeling so alien and so powerful it almost brought her to her knees. "You have sad eyes," the little girl said, with the simple, devastating honesty of a child. Abigail looked at the girl, and for the first time in what felt like a lifetime, a genuine, a fleeting smile touched her lips. "I do," she whispered, "but thank you for the bread." When the wagon was repaired and the family was ready to leave, the man, his name was John, tried to pay her. She refused. "You saved us," he said, his voice thick with gratitude. "We owe you our lives. What can we call you? What is your name?" Abigail looked at the family, at the small, fragile unit of love and hope they represented. She thought of the name she had been born with, and the one she had earned in blood. Neither felt right. "Just call me a traveler," she said. She watched them go, their wagon creaking its way toward a new life in the West. The encounter had not healed her. The scars on her soul were too deep for that. But it had shown her something. It had shown her that the skills she had learned for the purpose of death could also be used for the purpose of life. It had shown her that there was still a choice to be made. She did not ride on. She stayed in that quiet arroyo for a long time, thinking. The question was no longer who she was, but what she would be. A ghost, haunted by the past, or a traveler, defined by the road ahead. The legend of the Ashen Daughter faded from headlines into folklore, a grim but thrilling tale to be told when the nights grew long and the wind howled. The county she had scoured clean began to heal, new families and new laws slowly filling the vacuum left by Corbin's tyrannical reign. Her name, Abigail Thorne, was a footnote, a ghost tied to a tragedy. The name she had created, the Ashen Daughter, became an immortal part of the West's violent, romantic mythology. The woman herself chose a different path. She did not seek a new town, a new identity. She understood now that she could not outrun who she was. She had been forged in fire, and the scent of ash would always cling to her. So she chose to remain in the wild, empty spaces, the places where the past was a quiet companion rather than a screaming mob. She became a guardian of the forgotten trails, a silent protector of the lost and the vulnerable. She was not a lawwoman. She was not a hero. She was simply a presence. A family stranded by a broken wagon would find a freshly killed deer left by their camp in the morning. A prospector, lost and out of water, would stumble upon a series of deliberately placed rock cairns, leading him to a hidden spring. A group of settlers, about to be set upon by bandits, would hear a single, unexplained rifle shot from the high rocks, a warning that sent the bandits scattering. Convinced they had stumbled into a military patrol, she was never seen. Her only sign was the help itself, and sometimes, for those who knew the legend, the faint, unmistakable scent of wood smoke and ash that seemed to linger on the air after she was gone. She was no longer an avenger. She had become a quiet, anonymous force of grace in a landscape that had precious little of it. She was using the skills of the hunter to be a shepherd. Years later, a young, ambitious journalist from the East, the same one who had once sought the story of Jonah Graves, was traveling through the territory, collecting stories of its now fading legends. He came to the old mission, where Father Michael, now a very old man, still tended to his flock. The journalist asked him about the Ashen Daughter. "Ah, the girl of fire and blood," the old priest said, his eyes looking out toward the distant, hazy mountains. "A great tragedy. A soul torn by a grief few could imagine." "They say she died," the journalist said, "that her quest for vengeance consumed her." "Vengeance is a fire, it is true," Father Michael said, a wise, sad smile on his lips. "It consumes. But fire can also cleanse. It can clear the way for new growth." "So you think she is still out there?" the journalist pressed. The priest looked out at the vast, open land. A summer storm was gathering on the horizon, the air thick with the promise of rain. "I do not know if the woman is still out there," he said softly, "but her spirit is. Sometimes, when a great injustice is done, when the helpless are preyed upon by the strong, a story is told. They say that if you are in trouble, you should build a small fire, and send your prayers up with the smoke. And sometimes, just sometimes, a protector will come. A silent guardian with fire in her eyes, and the scent of ash in her wake." The legend of the Ashen Daughter had found its final form. She was no longer a story of a bloody, tragic end, nor a tale of a simple, hopeful new beginning. She had become an open-ended myth, a permanent part of the landscape, a whisper on the wind that said that even in the most desolate places, even after the most devastating fires, something of value, something of fierce, protective grace, can survive. And somewhere out there, in the vast, quiet heart of the West, a traveler, a woman with sad eyes, watched the storm roll in and, for the first time, felt the clean, hopeful scent of rain on the wind.